Story 1. My family and I have had issues with a neighbor that have been ongoing for years. When he initially moved in, my parents tried to establish a good relationship with him by helping him with gardening and acquainting him with the area. One autumn, my father was using a leaf blower mulcher hybrid on the front yard to clear leaves. The neighbor spotted him and asked to borrow the tool, to which my father agreed. Shortly after, the neighbor left with his entire family by car and only returned hours after my father had finished using the machine. My father went back inside the house after he was done, knowing they had left and not wanting to wait outside for their return. Hours later, there was a knock on the door, and my father opened it to see the neighbor on the other side, visibly angry. He berated my father about how it was rude that he did not wait outside to hand him the leaf blower mulcher the moment he came back, insisting that my father should have stayed outside the entire time waiting for him. My father, with his won't take nonsense from anyone personality, simply told the neighbor that he wasn't going to stand outside for an unknown period just to hand over the equipment. He also stated that he had fully intended to give the neighbor the equipment if asked, but now he wouldn't due to how rude and entitled the neighbor was behaving. This was the first incident of many. I can't fully recall the other incidents, but I know that tensions between my family and the neighbor only grew. Now, onto the main story. For context, my house is located in a very awkward spot. The neighborhood road, if you can call a few houses a neighborhood, was this small strip branching off from the main road, and our house faces this road, making it perpendicular to the main road. On the other side of the road from our house is a patch of forest containing a couple of very tall pine trees, some shrubs, and other greenery. The shrubs and greenery were short, and the trees, though mostly in front of our house, were spread out so we could easily see the houses on the other side of the patch. On the far side of the forest is the neighbor's house. His house directly faced the road and was perpendicular to it, with his fence up against the forest patch. The forest patch created a 6-foot barrier between the neighbor's fence and the neighborhood road. During the 2018 New Year, my family and I went on vacation and left the house for about a week. When we returned, we realized all but 3 pine trees were cut down, and 2 of the surviving trees were stripped of branches. Large patches of the greenery and shrubs were missing, and now there was an entire whole path leading right from the neighborhood road to the neighbor's house. We suspected it was our neighbor, as he had a history of cutting down trees. He had chopped off all the trees on his property shortly after moving in, including a small ironwood tree. The next day, bright and early, we saw a crew of people with trucks and a wood chipper on the neighborhood road in front of our house. My parents immediately went out and asked the crew what they were doing. According to them, they were hired by our neighbor to clear out the entire forest patch. My parents then headed over to the neighbor's house, which was more accessible now that there was literally a pathway through the forest patch, and knocked on his door. When he answered, my parents asked why he had hired a crew to clear out the forest patch. He responded that he was clearing it out so that he would have more land to sell to a development company. My parents asked why they were cutting into the forest patch without asking them, as each house owned parts of the forest patch, the portion in front of our houses, and the crew was clearly working on our part. He responded that he had gone to every house and asked for permission. All our other neighbors didn't care about the forest patch and said yes. When he came to our house, there was no answer as we were still on vacation at the time. The neighbor took the lack of answer as consent and began clearing the patch. My parents told him he had no right to be clearing out their portion of the forest patch without their permission, specifically the trees that were cut down, as the majority of the trees were in front of our house. He responded that the trees were within his property line, and he had done nothing illegal. As stated before, the forest patch put a 6-foot barrier between his fence and the neighborhood road. The 3 feet on his side was his property, while the 3 feet on our side would be ours. My parents then asked who he had hired to evaluate the property line, as the trees appeared to be on our side. With a smug smile, he responded that he had done it himself. My parents informed him that he needed an official from the county to verify the property lines. Again with a smug look, he said that he was in the right and closed the door. The crew hired by our neighbor assured us that they would not be doing any work on the forest patch until the situation was resolved. My parents immediately called someone from the county to come look at the property lines, and when they did, it showed that lots of greenery on our property had been removed and all but one of the trees cut down had been on our property. Over the next few days, the crew would return in the morning, but would always knock on our door and inform us they wouldn't be working anywhere near our patch. The neighbor finally came to our door a few days after the previous meeting with a morose look on his face and wanted to talk it out with my father, reaching a compromise. It would seem that the neighbor had finally gotten someone official to look things over and realized his grave mistake. My father demanded that the trees he cut down be replaced, not with saplings but actual trees. He allowed the 2 trees with no branches to be cut down as they would stick out like a sore thumb. The 2 trees were eventually cut down. I watched as they cut them down section by section and remembered the thumps they made when the sections hit the ground after being dropped. Now only the lone tree remains in the forest patch. Did the neighbor keep his promise? No. To this day, he has not replaced the trees. My parents aren't the kind to sue for money or retribution unnecessarily, and they didn't want to go through the stress of a lawsuit. So things just stayed tense on both sides while we ignored the neighbor and he avoided us. The forest patch used to be home to 2 owls I would hear hooting throughout the night. I missed them a lot, and there were never rats and rabbits around when they were there. Now, why am I posting this story now? Because the neighbor struck again this week. My room is right on top of the garage, and I can easily see the neighborhood road and the forest patch. I woke up to the sound of trucks and loud chatter on Monday, and when I looked out, I saw a crew of people with trucks, chainsaws, and a wood chipper. I immediately got my parents' attention, and my father again headed out to see what was going on. This crew was hired by our neighbor to do some work on the forest patch. Most of the work planned was to be done on the neighbor's property, but apparently some of it was to be done on ours too. My father informed them of what the neighbor had done before and that they weren't allowed to work on our property, though he did give his permission to cut down a scraggly bush that didn't look good. The crew understood and did their work on our neighbor's property, but left ours completely alone. Last night, I was upstairs playing a video game when I heard yelling downstairs. I faintly heard my mother saying, "We don't want to fight with you." I left the room I was in to hear my parents having an argument with my neighbor. I heard him shouting about how we're causing him issues and costing him money. I guess he paid in full upfront and couldn't get a partial refund for the work on our property that my father prevented. I didn't hear the whole conversation, so what I'm typing next is what I heard from my parents. He apparently was stomping his foot like a child and just kept shouting that my parents were being difficult and kept interfering. My parents kept telling him that he didn't have an easement onto our property and he wasn't allowed to modify it as he pleased. He shouted that he didn't know what an easement was and that it didn't matter. He should be allowed to make changes so he could sell the land to a development company. My parents just ended the conversation by repeatedly telling him to get legal advice or a lawyer before shutting the door in his face. I've been somewhat worried this guy will try to do something drastic sometime and have been considering getting a security camera. My parents have been telling me I'm just being paranoid, but honestly, if the current political climate says anything, it's that people are unpredictable. I have been given permission by my parents that if he ever comes onto the property again and won't leave, to use the garden hose on him. Update. Hi everyone, thank you for the advice. Concerning suing, yes, I have talked about that option many times with my parents when the tree incident first occurred. They both are the don't want to be on neighbor's bad side kind of people and always try to just avoid conflict rather than face it. Every time I try to bring it up, my father would just change the subject. And my mother would just tell me to drop it as it would stress out my father, who has a plethora of medical issues, including high blood pressure. Story 2. My sister smokes cigarettes. Not great to start with. On top of this, she smokes very expensive cigarettes. Each pack is almost $10. Which I didn't really care about before when she had a job, because how she spends her paycheck the parts not being used to care for her children anyway isn't really my business. But she quit her job, yes, during the pandemic a month or so ago because she, and I quote, don't want to deal with that difficult boss of mine anymore, and was coasting on the money she had saved. Well, now she's run out of money, not surprising, and instead of looking for another job, she's going to try selling her car. But in the meantime, she's broke with no way to buy cigarettes. I don't smoke, so she can't borrow anything from me. But our mother smokes, so she could technically borrow a couple from her. But she doesn't because mom smokes those low-quality cheap cigarettes. No, she wants her brand of cigarettes. She's never heard the term beggars can't be choosers, it seems. So she's been in a foul mood for a full week because she can't afford her expensive cigarettes, won't accept any cheap ones, and none of us are willing to spend $10 to buy her a pack she'll use up in maybe a week. But today I'd had enough of her immature attitude and decided to do her a favor. I said if she would go through the place a drive-through for me so I could get us all some food, her children included. Then I'd help her get some gas and a pack of cigarettes. She eagerly agreed but rejected my offer to get her any food. And place wasn't open, yet it was around 9:30 am, and they opened after 10 am, so she'd have to wait until they opened. Then she sort of paused and asked if I really wanted food from Place A and not Place B, which is closer. Place B is right next to the gas station, while Place A is maybe 2 buildings down, so still very close. I say no. I've been craving something specific from Place A, so she relents and says okay, and that she's going to be sitting outside drinking coffee until then. So maybe 20 minutes go by, and I go out to give her a written list of what to get because she doesn't have a great memory and will forget items, and I get close to the side porch door, which is open, and hear her complaining about having to go through the drive-thru for me to our mother. Just how I'm so rude for asking her to drive so far, and how food from Place A is just so terribly gross, and how she didn't even want to do this anyway. Well, I heard our mother tell her to be grateful because nobody else was offering to buy her food, gas, and her fancy cigarettes. Well, my sister scoffed and started saying something else, but I walked outside and she fell silent. Mother and she had wide-eyed looks, but I reached down and plucked my card, which she was going to use to get everything from her hand, and just said, "Never mind, I don't want to burden you. I'll order through a food delivery service instead." Then I walked back inside. She tried to call me back and say she was just messing around, but I ignored her, and when it was made clear I wasn't buying her things or coming back, I heard her pitching a huge childish fit and our mother laughing and telling her she did this to herself by being ungrateful. So yeah, my sister threw her fit and wore herself out before going and sitting in her car for a few hours to sulk. I really had no issue helping her if she did a little favor for me in return. But I'm not going to help anyone who complains about said help behind my back. Edit. For everyone commenting about her only smoking 1 pack a week, she typically smokes way more when she's not broke. She had to downgrade to only 1 pack a week after she ran out of money. And for where we live, $10 packs are somewhat pricier since the cheaper packs are like $2 for. But there are even more expensive cigarettes, though nobody here smokes them. Story 3. So about a month ago, I made a post about my stepmother. This is the original post. Well, about a month ago, she tried to come over to see my now 2-month-old baby at the time, 3 weeks old. About 2 weeks ago, one of our neighbors was telling us some lady kept knocking on our front door when we were gone. I wasn't sure who it was at the time. I let it brush my shoulder and told the neighbor to let me know if anything serious happens with the lady or call the police if it becomes concerning enough. A couple of hours ago, after bringing my daughter home from baby shopping, I saw police officers at my neighbor's and my house. I park in the driveway and take my daughter out. My husband isn't home as he was working late. My mother is out at a doctor's appointment. I'm completely confused at this point and am asked if this was, in fact, my home. I state yes and get told to wait momentarily. The police are talking to my neighbor, but I can't make out what they're saying. At this point, my daughter is crying, and I'm trying to calm her by bouncing her slightly. After a few minutes, the police asked me if I knew what was going on. I shake my head. I was told the lady my neighbor had mentioned had somehow gotten into the house, and there was a sign of forced entry, back door kicked in and lock broken due to force. My neighbor heard the commotion but thought it was my husband working on projects in the shed in the back. He does woodworking. About an hour later, my neighbor realized it wasn't my husband as she had seen lights weren't on and noticed that neither my husband's nor my cars were in the driveway. She also had seen movement in the house. My neighbor went to check the house and saw the back door broken into and called the police. At this moment, the lady is brought out from the house, and can you guess who it is? My stepmother. I was actually surprised. My stepmother is sobbing and crying that she had permission and couldn't get the door unlocked, so she had to kick it in. Police asked if they could go in with me to see if there was any damage done to my house as it's now a crime scene. I agree and look around. She broke photos, dishes, my daughter's crib. How? I don't even know. It was really sturdy and strong, shelves, all of my mother's belongings, our flat screen TV, etc. I tell them that she never had permission, nor was she ever welcomed at our place. They ask if we would like to press charges against her, and I state yes. She gets taken away, and I wait for my husband to come home to see what we will do. So we have assessed all the damage and found out more things were broken, like my husband's computer, some of my jewelry, our video game consoles, etc. My husband and I just filled out some papers on getting a restraining order, and we know a few other charges that she's facing. So the ones listed above, then possession of illicit substances, being under the influence of illicit substances, destruction of property over $5,000 after we told them how much was damaged with receipts. They aren't sure of a motive yet. They haven't interviewed her yet. When she was allowed a phone call last night, she did try to call our home phone to ask if we'd drop the charges and bail her out, but my husband hung up